None of us thought we'd get out alive, said David France of the AIDS epidemic. David is an investigative reporter and filmmaker whose previous research covered the Catholic sexual abuse scandal in the USA. But tonight, he'll be talking about how to survive a plague, the story of how activists and scientists tamed AIDS, a book which was shortlisted for the Wellcome Book Prize and won both the Baillie Gifford Prize for Nonfiction and the Green Carnation Prize for LGBTQ Literature. His documentary of the same name was a 2012 Oscars nominee and was nominated for 2 Emmys. Although David is a researcher and reporter, this book weaves his own story within that broader canvas of a society coming to terms with what seemed at the time like an apocalypse. If you knew one person who died, you knew dozens, he says. This is a story of remarkable characters who fought prejudice to change the minds of scientists, politicians, and others. It's therefore wonderful that we are also joined by Peter Tatchell, a campaigner for equal rights, including for LGBTQ community, and was a member of the AIDS activist group ACT UP in the 1980s and 1990s. Please join me in welcoming David France and Peter Tatchell to Charleston.
It's a great honor for me to join you here today and to share this platform with David. As someone who lived through that war, and it felt like a war, the AIDS pandemic in the 1980s and 1990s, his book is an incredibly powerful testament to the enormous innovation, sacrifice, and grit and determination of so many people who helped tame an epidemic that threatened the lives of millions and millions of people. It is thanks to the people documented in his book that AIDS today is a manageable illness, that HIV is no longer a death sentence. And what David has done has produced an extraordinary story, a really groundbreaking story about how that epidemic was defeated in a little over a decade. The greatest public health threat on a global scale was defeated in a little over a decade through incredible imagination, confrontation, and sheer determination by scientists, people with HIV and AIDS, activists, and doctors. It was their collective cumulative effort that enabled HIV to now be a chronic manageable condition from which in the West, very few people die today. In the rest of the world, of course, 1 million people or more are dying every year. So as someone who lived through that period and was involved in ACT UP London, the AIDS activist group, for me, David's story is very, very relevant, very much a story that I can engage with, very much a reflection of the experiences of myself and people here in Britain. Although David's story is primarily about the United States, what he tells of the US story also was replicated in Britain, France, Germany, Australia, and many other Western countries. So I'd like to invite David to maybe talk for 10 minutes or so just about the book and how he wrote it, why he wrote it, the battles and struggles to write it, and his reflections on that period of grave pandemic.
Thank you. And it's great to be here. I guess I started on this campaign to write this history because so much of the writing and thinking about the AIDS pandemic took place in the middle of the plague years, the years before 1996, when medication made survival from an HIV infection possible. And that includes seminal works like And the Band Played On, and Angels in America, and Paul Manette's two incredible memoirs. All of those produced before there was even any reason to believe that any of us would survive it. So there was a kind of a desperation and a kind of an unknown that permeates those works, as powerful as they are. And And after 1996, when the whole framework changed, when the drug breakthroughs were publicized, and it took a year or two for us to recognize just how powerful and lasting those drugs would be. We all kind of went silent on the effort to produce works about that time. And for many years, I'd been saying that a lot of good came out of the AIDS plague years, which some people thought was a horrifying description of those 15 years. But it's true that the kind of human activism that took hold and was recreated through the prism of that kind of mass death experience transformed so much about the world that we've passed on to future generations, not just about whether or not AIDS was going to kill everybody, but the way that drugs are researched has been changed fundamentally by the activism around the plague years, the way science is conducted, the way medicine is practiced. All of those things transformed by activism in the face of this deadly virus. But also the presence of gay people, LGBT people, in civic life, which, and it's hard to explain to audiences of people who have just inherited these kind of revolutionary changes, how far away we were from any sort of power or acceptability. That in that same 15 years, when we went from this darkening plague to survival, we went through the same activism from being a community of people almost entirely disenfranchised to one that had been embraced as being a community recognized and defended by laws and culture. So that revolution itself was phenomenal, and I started to talk to younger audiences about what that was like, and I discovered that that whole effort, that whole revolution, had been condensed somehow in popular thinking to a sentence like this: AIDS was bad, and then it got better. And it didn't just get better. It took this amazing and creative and tireless and terrifying battle to get to the place where we are today. And so that's why I turned back to those years, and I began my work historicizing the activism years in 2008, 2009. And at the time, it was for me to go back to people who had survived that time. I think you'll remember this, to ask them to go back there with me, to relive that with me, to let me understand where they were and what it was like for them, was almost too much. I was turned down by many people. I began interviews with people which they discontinued. It was just too difficult for them. There was this incredible reluctance to go back to that time of, certain death. And so it took me many years to get people to talk to me. And then when they did, I felt the burden of the responsibility of these stories and how to carry them forward and how to try to find the lessons in what was experienced. What did AIDS teach us? What positive impact did AIDS leave on culture? And that was the mission I gave myself when I started to write the book. I also made a documentary at the same time as doing the book, also by the same name. But in my research, I went back. I remembered that the AIDS activism years were chronicled by the AIDS activists themselves. It was the dawn of the camcorder, which was released in 1982 for the first time. And what that did is democratize the power to be able to record moving images. It was affordable suddenly for people to record those things. And much the way cell phones are used today to record important junctures in activism. People carried around large cameras on their shoulders, and so one of the things that I did for my research was to go back and ask to see that footage, to remember what it felt like, to remember what it looked like, and the quantity of footage was so stunning that I set a mission for myself to try and make that into a film. And I ultimately brought in 700 hours of activism footage from over a 6-year period, and the movie allows you to go back into that time, I think, and to understand and feel what it was like to be that threatened with extinction. And it kind of launched me through the rest of my reporting and research for the book. And that's kind of the origin story, I guess, of the book. I did, at some point late in the process, I felt it necessary to put myself in the book, which I wasn't expecting to do. And I recognized that I was writing a witness account of an almost unbelievable piece of history, and that it was incumbent upon me to let the reader know who the witness was and what the experience of witnessing that period was. And it's the first time I wrote about myself. I don't like to write about myself. I don't like to speak about myself. But for me, I realized that I also had the same reluctance, and that was maybe one of the most difficult things I have ever tried to do, is to kind of open my own history and lay it out on the page, and remember. And so in a way, in a really important way, How to Survive a Plague is about remembering.
I think you've touched upon the experience and effect. I mean, living through that period, particularly the early period of HIV and AIDS in the 80s, it was like living through a war. Never in peacetime before had so many young men in their late teens and early 20s died of this devastating new illness. And I can remember, apart from the people I knew and very well as friends who died, you'd go to a club, as I did in the 80s, and there's always regulars there who'd see every week. Then suddenly they weren't there anymore. They were dead, or in hospital first, and then they died. And it is so hard for people who weren't in that community and affected by it to understand just how devastating this epidemic was. That people you knew, whether just socially and anecdotally or coincidentally in a club or a bar, or they were personal friends or lovers or ex-lovers, they just fell like soldiers being cut down in a battle. And the level of grief was just so overwhelming. I can remember it came a time when I struggled to go to funerals. There were just so many. And I thought about my grandfather when he fought in the First World War, and the story he told about his comrades dying. And I felt I was living through a different version of that. Do you want to just talk a little bit more about that?
I don't think I could say it better, but there came a time, I think, for all of us who were there, where the grief, it became impossible to grieve, and increasingly difficult to go to those memorial services. And I think that it's somehow, and I made it through the plague years without contracting HIV, and which didn't mean that I thought I was going to survive. But something that allowed us to survive, I think, was our ability to somehow put away that grief and maybe save it for another time. And I think maybe that's what I discovered when when I started looking back was that people hadn't yet reopened those boxes and hadn't yet, examined their own response or the pain that we've all carried, I think. And, I certainly wanted to let people know what that was like. I wanted, in telling the story, to bring a reader there to show what it was like, to let them experience what it was like to not know from page to page, from day to day, who was going to make it and who wasn't. But at the same time, there was a kind of a community-wide celebration of life that became heightened, I think, because of the perils and the mass death. It became its own sort of unique culture, and I wanted to capture that also. And there was certainly gallows humor accompanied what we were experiencing, and there were, the tools of self-protection, I guess you would call it, that we all found ways to harness to allow us to experience this without it killing us emotionally.
I think it's often those of us who are still HIV negative, we often feel, why me? Why did I survive when these wonderful friends of mine contracted this virus and died? And it was really, I think, pure chance. I remember I went to San Francisco in 1981. I had my fair share of sex. Luckily, I wasn't infected, but it was just pure chance and luck. Mm. And then I think of other people. I had two friends who got HIV from their first ever boyfriends. Their boyfriends never knew they had HIV, so they passed it, without any knowledge or intent. But both they and their partners eventually died. How cruel. So, I haven't got over the grief. And as we're talking about now, I'm thinking, going through my mind is all the images of the faces and the people I knew who'd gone. It's very, very, very hard, even all these decades later, to deal with. The other point I want to pick up on was the revolution in healthcare. HIV and the response to it produced a series of changes that are of lasting benefit to everyone. As you mentioned, the new protocols for drug trials, whether they be for cancer, cystic fibrosis, or whatever, they're all now much more effective, efficient, and speeded up as a result of the way in which AIDS activists challenge the traditional, long, drawn-out, endless trials that used to happen. The other thing is, of course, the HIV pandemic rewrote the doctor-patient relationship. The idea of the active doctor, the passive patient. Many people with HIV knew more about this disease and the immune system than their own doctors. And I think that's, it has provoked a really big rethink in the way we do medicine and the way in we treat patients, the way in which, patients themselves take responsibility and take charge much more. Do you want to explain a little bit more about that, how that happened and what it involved?
Well, in the very early days of the epidemic, starting in 1981, there was only a handful of doctors who were seeing sick patients, and they were almost exclusively gay and lesbian physicians who were practicing almost exclusively within the community. And it's important to remember how isolated and segregated our communities were back then, that we were consigned to life in ghettos, in specific neighborhoods where we had moved in significant numbers so that we could defend one another, so we could find some semblance of safety and security and comfort. And I described the 1970s as being the world's largest migration of gay people in world history. After the Stonewall riot of 1996 that launched, 1969, that launched the modern movement, people started looking for one another and started looking for these kind of pockets of liberation. And that's where we were with our own doctors and our own newspapers and our own kind of community presence when HIV hit in 1981. And those doctors were as confused as anybody about what was happening, and they began this kind of consultation with the patient to try to figure it out. It wasn't until 1983 and 1984, a number of years into the epidemic, that it was determined conclusively that it was being caused by an infectious agent. So there was much guesswork going on, and it created these kind of partnerships with doctors. And I think from there forward, the population, the afflicted population, demanded that kind of relationship with their physicians, and it changed the way future physicians are trained, and it changed the entire expectation, really, of the power and role of the patient in patient treatment. You talked about the effect on drug trials. AIDS activists also demanded a place not just at the table where trials were being designed, but at the bench where pharmaceutical science was being practiced, where basic science was being practiced. And it was the first time ever that patients became partners at that level, that kind of molecular level of science and medicine, and created this model now that's practiced all across the world and all across every disease state of community advisory boards, where research centers and pharmaceutical researchers and the big pharma invite members of communities, afflicted communities, to come and sit in panels to describe to them and comment to them on how their work is going and what they need to do and to what concessions they need to make in order to be able to bring the population of sick people in to test the drugs quickly and effectively and humanely.
Another point you raised in your opener was about the way in which the HIV pandemic enabled LGBT people, particularly gay and bisexual men, to have a place at the table, at the top table, which they'd never really had before. So in this country, for example, after the government demonizing homosexuality for decades, eventually, even under Margaret Thatcher's government, gay people were invited to the Department of Health to meet the health minister personally. And he listened. The health minister, to his credit at the time, he listened. And as a result, LGBT-led organizations had a direct input into government policy. It wasn't always straightforward, but certainly never before in the history of this country had LGBT people ever been invited to the top table, ever been invited to consult with and dialogue with government. So that was a huge change. Now, the other thing that's worth mentioning, again, which you alluded to, was it was activists who invented the concept of safer sex. That was our response to this epidemic. A particular way of having sex to reduce the likelihood of transmission. And we popularized it, and it saved countless lives.
It's hard to remember that it had to be invented. I mean, it kind of seems like why would you have to invent safe sex? But the idea that at that time that gay men would use condoms was nobody would have thought of that. It was like the furthest thing from anybody's mind, and that a handful of activists conceived of this idea before it was known how AIDS was caused, and popularized it. And it was quickly taken up across the globe. And you see that in studies of the transmission of other diseases like gonorrhea and syphilis. Those numbers fell right off a cliff, 60% in some cities, 80% in other places. And that meant that people were doing it, where people were adopting this huge behavioral change And you're right. I mean, there's no way to actually measure how many infections were avoided as a result of that, but it has to have saved countless lives.
It's interesting, in that period, as gay men were adopting safer sex and infection rates were beginning to fall, not just HIV, but as you say, other sexually transmitted infections, among young straight people who weren't practicing safer sex, the incidence of those infections rocketed. Not so much HIV, but chlamydia, gonorrhea, syphilis, and so on. So nowadays, of course, thankfully in lots of schools, not all schools, but increasingly in schools, condom use and safer sex is taught. And again, it is, helping safeguard and protect the health of not just LGBT kids, but straight kids as well. So again, the lessons and the positives go much wider than the LGBT community.
You talk about being invited in by Thatcher and her people. We weren't invited anywhere in the States. None of that came at the end of an invitation. That was, and that's the lesson I think that ACT UP gives us. So the epidemic began in 1981. By 1987, there still was not a single drug to take because the public health system had not mobilized in any fashion to try to find any sort of medicine for this. And nobody was doing anything, and a new kind of activism began, and that was the birth of ACT UP, which stood for the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, which tells you something about what they thought they were going to be able to do, or at least about how angry everybody was. And they started pounding on the doors, and the only reason that AIDS activists got any audience with anybody was because of the armies of these scrappy, people who are willing to commit, civil disobedience, who are willing to chain themselves to doors, lay down in front of cars, and scare people, really to scare people, that any of those meetings took place in the United States.
I think here, certainly, AIDS activism was very much driven by primarily younger people, primarily gay and bisexual men. And many of these people had no previous history of activism, right, no previous experience. Many of them were just not long out of school, but they were affected by this epidemic, or their friends were, and they wanted to do something. And through their revolution in their own consciousness and their own commitment, as you mentioned, thousands or tens of thousands of lives have been saved. And so it's an extraordinary, ACT UP and all the activists from the different organizations, there ought to be, a huge memorial to their sacrifice and determination, how they fundamentally changed the narrative, changed government policy, and did save so many lives. And there is no memorial in Britain to
or anywhere
people with HIV and AIDS or with the activists who fought it. Right. And there should be. There should be. It is one of the most extraordinary social progressive movements of the 20th century. Do you want to just say a little bit more, just where we are now?
Where are we now? All right, so 96 comes along, and the drugs come along, and there was a lot of standing down of activism. People were disoriented with the idea that there was some future that was completely unexpected and unplanned for. There's a lot of exhaustion. There was a lot of that bottled up grief that we were talking about. And yet there still took hold a movement to assure access to these drugs around the world. And the fact that anybody outside of kind of Western capitals has access to effective antiretroviral treatment is because of that activism. And that activism is ongoing. Today, it's an estimated 45 million people alive with HIV today. Almost half of them, or about half of them, have been reached by these drugs. And that was something we were told was never in the realm of possibilities initially, because who would Could we rely on people in the developing world to take their medicine on a regular basis? Could we, all these kind of paternalistic dismissals that were just rejected by activists around the globe, and lots more work needs to be done in that regard. But that's been a huge breakthrough. When in 2012 my film came out, and at that point there were only 6 million people on treatment around the world. So the numbers are just doubling, all over the place, and that's remarkable.
And a lot of that treatment, the fact that it exists, again, is down to activists who demanded that the big pharmaceutical companies drop their prices or make special concessions for people in the global south, in developing countries which are not rich, not powerful, not influential, don't have much leverage. But the activists did say, this isn't just for people in the West, this is for people across the globe, and the big pharmaceutical companies cannot get away with charging these prices to leave tens of millions of people in the developing world without these life-saving drugs. And so again, an incredible act of altruism and global solidarity that again has saved millions and millions of lives.
It's a whole new movement, of course, but it includes some people from the drug development movement. Some of the people in my book became central players in taking the message of activism to outside of the boundaries of the West, and helping to create a treatment access movement that's been really it's been really a kind of a remarkable success. And the other argument that people were making that is true and important is that getting treatment to people who are sick around the world is also a key tool to slowing the spread of the disease. Because what we learned, there's so many miracles that came out of the development of these medications in 1996. We learned that effective treatment, a patient on effective treatment, is not infectious. Kind of this remarkable discovery that means that it's not only a good idea to save an individual's life with a medication, but it saves multiple other people's lives by giving them the medication. And so treatment as prevention, as you know, has been this kind of remarkable sub-discovery of the breakthroughs from '96.
I think at that point, I'd like to open it up to questions and contributions from the floor. So if you would like to ask David a question or make a point, please raise your hand. There's a roving mic. So we have people over here.
Thank you. Does that work? Yeah. Thank you. That was amazing. David, you said that there's this sort of view now that AIDS happened and it was bad, and now it's fine. Why do you think there is that view? Why do you think sort of people of my generation basically don't know about it and don't learn about ACT UP and everything?
I think it's my fault. I think it's our fault. I think we who were there stopped talking about it. And not because it was convenient to stop talking about it, because we were all, PTSD'd, into, orbit. We couldn't do it, and it was not easy. And now I'm a journalist, right? So I began in journalism in the early '80s. So I've been covering the HIV epidemic since its first weeks. But after '96, I discovered that it was near impossible to get any publications or editors to allow you to continue writing and reporting on the story. It was like there was so much, people were so overwhelmed by all those years of the AIDS bad news that people wanted to take a break from it. And initially when I tried to carry my book proposal around to interest publishers in the story, they were not interested. They said, we've heard the AIDS story, we've heard that narrative, and that's where I was saying that there's a lot of good came out of this. That in fact, all those narratives that we heard previously were about death and dying, and I knew that the story of AIDS was about triumph, about creativity, and about kind of this remarkable kind of new paradigm of patient agency that's really the story of the plague years. And so I think there was a number of reasons why we weren't telling the story or being able to tell the story. So the story just wasn't getting out. I think, actually, I've noticed that in many instances, historical instances of like mass death and mass dying, that there is a period of time between the end of that troubled period and the time when we are ready to look back on it, to teach it, to challenge it, to try and learn from it. And that's about a 15-year period. And I think it's been about 18 years, I think, since, my math is terrible, but it's 22 years now, yeah. I think we're ready as a people to start telling, your generation what happened and what it meant. And not just, now I don't want to say it's all this stuff about, rah-rah. Like there's awful shit that happened then, just awful, in politics and in science and in medicine, just hideous stuff, I write about it in the book that there were it was routine to not accept patients with AIDS in hospitals. In New York, the epicenter of the epidemic, for the first couple of years, there was only one undertaker in all of New York City, maybe in all of the East Coast, that was willing to take the bodies of people who died of AIDS. Doctors, when polled, said something like 8 to 2 that they would not treat a person with HIV if they had the ability to avoid that. So, I mean, there are reasons why the first account of the epidemic, which came out in July of 1981, said that there were 41 cases of this new disease. And there's a reason it went from 41 cases to now 45 million alive and another 45 million dead from the disease. What fueled that expansion was this real criminal negligence on the part of so many players. And there were crimes, but there was also this kind of undying, like human force that the community somehow mustered that brought us through all that, and that is pretty remarkable.
I think it's quite important to remember that in this country, when initially it was only gay and bisexual men dying, the Conservative government of Margaret Thatcher would not engage, would not do anything. When the Terence Higgins Trust was set up, the first HIV organisation in this country, by gay men, and most of them with HIV themselves, they got no government funding for the first years. There had to be, as you said, protests and demands, pressure put on the government to give even a small amount. I think the first grant from the government was £35,000. Pathetic. But, eventually, with the activist pressure on the government, that money did increase, and eventually the Terence Higgins Trust and other relevant organisations did get substantive funding, and they were the ones who really, led this whole new agenda about safer sex, HIV prevention, education. And a lot of it was funded, there was some government funding, but a lot of it was funded by LGBT people giving out of their own pocket. Mm-hmm. A lot of those early safer sex campaigns and HIV awareness campaigns were funded by ordinary LGBT people and some straight allies. And that is, we have to remember that. And we also have to recall that, the ghastly tabloid headlines, the gay plague, headline in the Daily Express, I think it was, 1 million of us are going to die, gay and bisexual men are the enemy within. I mean, complete demonization of a whole community. So, yeah, it was a tough period.
Hi, I was really struck by your how you compared it to the First World War, and I feel like the community and you guys have survived this extraordinary traumatic experience. And yes, you've survived this plague physically, and and there are people living with HIV, on the antiretroviral drugs. But I was just wondering, you slightly referred to it, David, about this. You must surely there's a collective kind of PTSD coming out of that experience. And I was wondering if not just the sort of science of like, here's a pill, you'll be a bit better, but psychologically, if kind of therapy has improved in that, and maybe there's something that the military could potentially learn from what you guys have been through. Or, I was wondering if you could speak to that side of things.
We haven't figured it out. I don't think that we've done any of that work. And I think that, I think it might be a generation or two, in the future, it might be on their shoulders to try to figure out what happened to us and what it meant. I expected in my research that I would find, a body of a psychosocial research around previous mass death experiences, the atomic bombing in Japan, the Nazi camps, but there's just no science. We have not gone to those periods and tried to wrestle from them lessons in what it means to have so constricted the psyche of the people who were there. And I don't know how you convince people to start studying those things, but there's nobody, I can tell you that, who is studying that in the gay male and bisexual populations that went through those plague years. There have been people who have called for it, but it just hasn't happened. And in recent years, and this is after my documentary came out, there was a movement among survivors to create a movement, right? A political movement to draw attention to AIDS surviving syndrome or AIDS survivor syndrome, which they called ASS. So they wanted to study ASS. And they've been calling for it now for a couple of years, but so far ASS has not been studied.
I think there is probably, for psychological, emotional reasons, we probably do need at some point the equivalent of a War Veterans Association. An association of people who've been through that period, who have perhaps have survived, long term with HIV, or who have lost partners and lovers. There probably is the need for that kind of organization to go through this whole to finish this grieving process and to, more fully document the real deep psychological and emotional damage that has been suffered. And a lot of people, I don't think, have really acknowledged it or come to terms with it yet. And right. When we're talking about, as you say, more than 2 decades since these life-saving drugs came on stream.
I opened the book at a funeral in 2012 of one of the people whose activism he was one of the 25 or 30 people on the very front lines of AIDS treatment activism, who can take as much credit as anybody else for the breakthroughs that came in 1996, who somehow, in the years after that, mysteriously stopped taking the pills himself without explanation. Nobody knew. Here's the guy who fought tooth and nail so that other people could live, so that millions of people could live with the disease. And something about his own trauma kept him from pushing forward into a kind of a life of ongoingness, an ordinary existence that, and in some way we let him down. And I wanted to begin with that at the start of this long history, to say that there's something about having gone through all of that that is unshakable.
Anybody else?
As you've said, in the height of the plague, there was animosity, spite, evil in high places in some cases. Has that battle been won in the days of Trump and some of the religious beliefs?
I know you know the answer to that. Well, we thought so, and maybe that's the problem with victory, is that you can't always rely on it. Trump, like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, puts ideology ahead of everything else, and science is low on his level of interest. This anti-science moment that we're in is very similar to the period that gave us the epidemic, not that gave us HIV, but that made that into this plague. And I think we as a society are more woke now and more attuned to it, but we're no less powerless, I don't think, right now. I don't think we feel any more powerful now than the community that was assaulted by HIV in the early 80s felt power. And it's a fight. I mean, it's a fight we're all going to have to be ready for, I think, and to safeguard the progress that we've made so far.
I think I'd just perhaps add, although I was very critical of Margaret Thatcher's government in the early days, eventually our government did do a response that was actually far better than the United States or many other countries. Mm-hmm. But that, again, was only due to the campaigning of AIDS activists and straight friends and allies. Mm-hmm. It's only because they kept on pushing the government. And, Britain would have had vastly more HIV deaths had it not been for the National Health Service. The fact that we have socialized medicine in this country put us in a completely different place from the United States, where healthcare is privatized. And, if anybody has any qualms or doubts about the way things are going, we must hold on to this National Health Service, because it has been such an important safeguard for not just people with HIV and AIDS, but for all sick people. And, the trend towards privatization, which is happening now, we have got to stop that. We don't want to go down the road of an American-style system. And if we'd had that system, loads and loads more people would have died. I think there was someone else.
How difficult was it to engage the drugs companies in first researching and then developing effective treatments? And are there any lessons for other marginalised groups, say dementia patients, that are in desperate need of effective therapies?
It's a good question. They were resistant is a kind word to describe the role of drug researchers, both in pharma and in academic research. From the very first days, nobody wanted, once HIV was identified, none of the labs would bring HIV in for testing. They just didn't want to touch it, and it was not worth it to them, because the course that they saw HIV taking had nothing to do with them and their lives. And they really did believe that it had to do with a kind of a divine response to what somebody once called a filthy vice. So it took this kind of clever innovation in activism, I keep calling it. But so I talked about the armies that knocked down the doors, but what ACT UP worked with was a model they called the inside-outside approach. So they created experts among themselves, and once the armies of activists opened the doors, the experts went in. And and once they got there, the armies kept the doors open. Now, nobody wanted to actually talk with AIDS activists or even be in the same room with an AIDS patient for the first decade of the epidemic. So it was not a happy marriage, but ultimately it was not just a relationship that researchers were forced into, but they began to see it as being beneficial to them in their work. One of the interesting things I learned looking back at this period was the role that AIDS treatment activists played in convincing pharma that there that there was profit to be made in research in AIDS, and so they used the language of money to speak with these major institutions, and they did it again, with a carrot and a stick, and they said you can make a fortune off of AIDS drugs, or if you refuse to do this, we're going to drive your stock prices into the ground. And they had methods that they used of embarrassing drug companies, of shaming drug companies, of making drug companies seem like something you really wanted to divest yourselves of. And they could make big dents in the market valuation of these companies. So it was a forced relationship, a shotgun marriage, but one that in the end produced real allegiances and real kind of working relationships. Now, we've seen it replicated in breast cancer research, and that was the first of the other health disease states that adopted this kind of method of activism and of engaging with researchers. But we haven't seen it, you're right, in all. What we do see is patients in all categories being consulted, but we don't have kind of that effective kind of teamwork, the establishing of goals, for the industry by the patients themselves. You mentioned dementia, which would be a hard category, one would imagine, to negotiate to round up patients into activism around. And some issues are more difficult than others that way, but it's a method that can be replicated and has been replicated.
Others?
Hi, Peter. In the early 90s, I was a volunteer in France in an AIDS organization. And through our doors, we saw a lot of LGBT people coming. But there was another population who came also through the door, and it was the people with drug addiction. And we went to more funeral to people with drug addiction than to our friends, LGBT people. And these population where we didn't have the power to defend themselves, and so through our LGBT organization, they were helped enormously through that, and there was many changes through the healthcare, also through the program of needle exchange that benefited not only those one but other population. So my question to you, Peter, in your work as a journalist, did you interview or did you see this parallel going on through this LGBT and drug addiction illness?
Is that for David?
Oh yes, sorry, David. Yes, it's just because I saw your name there, so I saw David Peter. So and after that, just a personal question. Just you don't have to answer that. Just by curiosity, how do you know each other? Through your work, through activism? I just because I see you two on here together. So just how did you know each other?
I've known of Peter and Peter's work since the early '80s, and my journalism began in the LGBT press. I think we first met when I was reporting an article for GQ magazine about an Iraqi refugee here in
Ali Hilli.
Ali Hilli, yeah, fascinating story.
Yeah.
And you were central in making sure the world knew about that story, and so thank you. So we go back. When was that? That was
I would say mid-80s.
Yeah, I guess.
Maybe late 80s, yeah.
Which underscores, again, how weird it is to survive. And you go, from the 80s, that's a long time ago. We got old. We got old when so many people didn't. And how amazing is that? And how unexpected is that? I have to say, I still feel like I'm in my 20s somehow. Like I feel like somehow I got arrested somehow in that time. And I think I realized that when I was writing the book, was that it's hard to escape that. The epidemic, of course, began with gay men. But right from the start, it was clear that that blood products were transmitting the disease, and then within a very short period of time, it became clear that IV drug users were sharing their needles and therefore sharing their blood products, and that an epidemic was underway in that community as well, which threatened not just IV drug users, obviously, but the people that they were having sex with and the children that they were siring. And so it became a real challenge to the public health officials to try to figure out a response to that. And it also was a challenge to the movement, which had begun as such a white kind of movement of privilege among gay men who, I mean, the gay men who were making noise were the gay men who were not, who had a feeling of that they were owed a certain response by medicine and science and government. They weren't the marginalized members of our community initially. They were people like Larry Kramer, who was one of the early voices in AIDS activism, and he was a man who came from the highest echelons of society. He had graduated from the best schools that we have in the States and had made a name for himself already in his field. And he was just not going to allow the government and industry to ignore what was going on as much as they wanted to. It was hard for that movement to open its arms to what we were calling at the time the new epidemic, the new face of the epidemic in the HIV drug using community. And so that although it was not initially a comfortable allegiance, it was something that the movement took on very seriously. Needle exchange was something that was invented by AIDS activists, and at a time throughout most of Western civilization, it was illegal to market in clean needles, that they did it anyway, and they did it illegally, and they risked arrest and were arrested, in fact, for setting up needle exchange facilities in urban areas where IV drug use was endemic. And so the movement grew as the epidemic grew, and the leadership of the movement changed as the population, the afflicted population, changed. And so by 1996, the epidemic was, at least in my country, was an epidemic of the poor, of people of color, and including gay men in those categories, and IV drug users and their loved ones, and they were working together in really effective and interesting ways to make progress, both in this kind of elite form of activism that I write about in the book, which is treatment activism, as well as all the social aspects of activism, like housing for people with HIV and needle exchange, as I said, but also demonstrations in condom usage in parts of the city that were just, and parts of the country that were detached from healthcare and from access to public health campaigns. So it was, it was a slow-moving but successful joining of campaigns. I think that's probably true here too.
Yes. I mean, the other group that were affected very early on, of course, were people with haemophilia who were dependent on blood products. And I can remember, I can't remember exactly when it was, but very early on, activists here in Britain worked out that probably, we didn't know, but probably this was an infectious agent which was sexually transmitted, but possibly could also be transmitted by blood. And I remember lobbying the government really early on to say blood products have to be screened, that blood imports from the United States in particular should be stopped because the epidemic was already taken well hold there, and plus a lot of those blood products were donated by people who were on the margins and potentially at greater risk of HIV. And I can remember, for I think it was 3 years, the government refused to stop the foreign imports of blood products and to screen the blood, which meant that thousands of people with haemophilia became needlessly, unnecessarily infected. And even to this day, the government is refusing to compensate. Even to this day. And my heart goes out to those people. I don't buy the argument of innocent and guilty people, but definitely, it's absolutely tragic that people with haemophilia who depended upon the health service to have treatment and expected to get safe treatment were actually denied it for, I think it was 2 or 3 years, even though the suspicion and likelihood was very strong that they were going to be at high risk of infection from blood products. So that is still an unfinished story in this country. And as you know, there's still a campaign going on in this country to get the much-deserved compensation for the people who went through that and their families and loved ones. I think we've got time for one more question, and then I think we have to go.
Hi, mainly a question for David. So you mentioned very briefly at the beginning, and the band played on. What is it which your book brings new to the table?
The book And the Band Played On has long been considered the seminal text about the early epidemic, and it's a book it's a really incredibly written book, and a really powerful read. It's also wrong in many aspects, and it's a narrative that takes us from 1981 to early 1985. That's when the book ends. It mistakenly misdirects the story of AIDS as a West Coast San Francisco story, and San Francisco was not where things were happening in the early epidemic. It's not where activism was taking hold. It was not where any of the kind of important organizational work was taking place that laid the foundation for the kind of activism that by 1985 still hadn't taken hold, but by 1987 launched ACT UP. And ACT UP was really the game changer, which was missed by Randy Schultz, the author of And the Band Played On. He just published too early, and he died too early. He died in the 80s of AIDS himself, and so he didn't have the opportunity to correct his own oversights. And I'm not sure that he would have. He was very much against ACT UP and that kind of activism. He didn't see purpose in it. But he would have, I'm sure, if he had lived through 1996, seen the role that it played and been converted to the side of ACT UP. So he missed activism. I think that's what it is. So it's Band Played On is a story about the clouds gathering on the horizon, and it's a devastating story. And I wanted to find the rest of the story.
So I think, is there any final words you want to say, just very, very briefly, before we wind up?
No.
Nope. Well, let me say thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And to everybody here today, please do read this book and see the film. They are two extraordinary documentaries about this epidemic with its implications and lessons for all of us in the whole of our society. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for the work you've done to tell the story, to tell how this epidemic was tamed, and the extraordinary people and activism that made it possible. You've done a great public service in reminding us, informing us, and I suppose even cajoling us that change happens, positive change happens, when people say, enough is enough. I want to change things. We can do things differently. And you've certainly done that with your book. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Peter.
Please join me.
Thank you, everybody.
I really want to echo the comments of our first questioner to say it feels like such an extraordinary story which needs to be told again and again to subsequent generations. As you said yourself, a story about remembering. It was fascinating for me to hear the wider social and political benefits that have come from the activism that both of you and your generation achieved. So it's a real honour to have you here at Charleston. David, you described your book earlier as a witness account for an almost unbelievable bit of history. It's felt that this evening, hearing you both talk has been a part of that as well. So, David France, Peter Tatchell, thank you both very much indeed. David
will be signing the book out the back.
David will be signing his
please
book
do
out the
join
back.
him for a book signing and some chat.
That's great. If you could just stay seated while I take the speakers through to the book signing room, that would be great. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.